Hi everyone, and welcome back to the final part of our three-part series on the Glossary of Language Techniques. Now these techniques, as we've discussed, are really important in your English analytical and creative studies. So in this video, we're simply going to be continuing looking at those techniques and examples of how you can apply them in your work. So let's start by looking at the technique of persona. Now, persona is a voice or character adopted by the author, especially in poems. It's really a way of giving a voice to something, expressing all different types of people, different types of voices in one distinct voice that the author's created. A poem may be written in first person and still not be personally relevant to the author. So even if the poet or the writer is using I, they're not necessarily talking about themselves. Instead, they could actually be talking from the perspective of that character, the persona that they've created for themselves. The author often pretends to be a character, and that really is a good way of summarizing what persona means. So, example of persona, if we look at Melina Marchetta's text, Looking for Alibrandi, the line, "I have the dubious honour of being vice captain," which is kind of like being runner-up at the Miss Universe beauty pageant. So we get that sense of I there, we're getting the perspective of the main character, Josie. And through her persona that's being created, we're seeing humour, we're seeing a bit of cheek, a bit of spunk. That's how persona is created. Personification is also a technique which is really important. So this is when objects or animals are endowed with human thoughts, actions, perceptions, or emotions. So it's really when objects are given, the sort of things that humans might also do. This is an abstract concept. For example, love or death might be portrayed as being human. Animals are not actually made into humans, as in the technique of anthropomorphism we've already looked at. So it's not like an animal is a human, it's just that there's an animal with some human characteristics. So if we look at an example of personification, the stars dance playfully in the moonlit sky. So we get the sense that the stars are dancing, they're doing a human action, yet they're stars so they can't dance. The bees played hide and seek with the flowers as they buzzed from one to another. So again, the bees, they're playing a human game, they're playing hide and seek. They really have that sense of human characteristics even though they're not actually human. Point of view is another technique we can look at. So this is when the identity of the narrative voice is made very clear through the writing. So third person, for example, abstract, omniscient, or limited narrator. This is where things like she or character names are going to be used. First person is the complete opposite of this, and this is when we're getting things like it being narrated by a character in the story, and so therefore the perspective of I, and a more personal narration. This establishes different kinds of audience relationships and different ways of telling and expressing a story. So if we look at this example, I hate getting up in the morning, it's the worst part of the day. That I voice there is very petulant, very stubborn about her point of view. But then we can contrast that to, James thought that getting up in the morning was the worst part of the day. So the same line, the same message, except in one line it's I doing it, and in the second line it's James doing it. So James's story from two different points of view. A simile is also another technique which we can look at. So a simile is an indirect relationship. We talked about metaphors being one thing is another. It's direct relationship. The simile is the opposite. It's where one thing is like another. So one thing or idea is described as being similar to another one. Not identical, but similar. Similes usually contain the words like or as. So if you see these words, that's the sort of keyword should be setting off alarm bells in your head that this is a simile and you need to identify it. So example-wise, her eyes were as bright as the sun, blue as the sky, but soft as silk. So 3 points of comparison there using the word as. We're really getting a really solid description of this girl's appearance. Symbolism is another technique which we've used, and we've looked at it briefly in reference to the technique of a motif. However, we'll just expand on it a bit further. Symbolism is the use of specific objects or images to represent abstract ideas. So this is more often metaphoric than symbolic. So it really has a wider meaning. It's not just like, seeing a stop sign. Obviously that's a symbol. But it's more like a symbol of a wider concept. A symbol must be tangible or visible. So basically it's where one thing literally exists, you can touch it, you can hold it, and that represents a more abstract thing that you can't touch or hold. So the idea it symbolizes must be abstract or universal. So if we look at an example, we'll see she cried on the footpath, the rain pouring around her. So the rain and her tears are symbols of that depressive emotion. All her clothes were bright yellow. So bright yellow is really that color symbolism for joy, for happiness, for how, happy this person is in life. Or it was illegal here, so she hid the book in her backpack. So that action of hiding the book can really be a symbol of, the repression of education, for example. So we see that symbolism can be used on different levels, expressing emotions and also being represented by different things such as through colors or actions or, characters in particular. Repetition is another technique which we can look at. This is a specific word, phrase, or structure repeated several times for emphasis. So this one's pretty obvious to spot and one which you should definitely have a grasp of. So it's used to show an idea that it is eternal and continuous, one which needs emphasis and one which is important. This creates a particular tone or sound. So if we look at Emily Dickinson's poem, I am nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? That repetition of nobody there is really stressing her point, stressing her frustration to the reader. So we're seeing that repetition is that means of emphasis, which lets you know exactly what to be looking for, basically. Tone is another technique which you can look at. So this is the apparent emotional state or attitude of the speaker's voice. So how do they feel and how do they express how they feel? This refers only to the narrative voice, not to the author or to the characters. So it's very separate to that concept. So if we look at an example in Harper Lee's novel To Kill a Mockingbird, the line, Atticus was feeble, he was nearly 50. That's where we get the sense that this is a young, naive voice telling the story. Because a man who's only 50 is being described as, feeble and old and about to die, basically, by this young figure. So we really see that difference in perspective there. If an adult was telling the story, they wouldn't have the same perspective. So this is where tone really expresses ideas at a wider point. This shows the naive tone of the young girl narrator. Verbal irony is another technique which you can look at. Now this is where the meaning of a specific expression is actually the exact opposite of what the words literally mean. So sarcasm, for example, is a tone of voice that often accompanies verbal irony. So it's a way of saying something but really meaning something else. Similar, but not the same. So here again, we're getting that sense that a lot of language techniques are overlapping, but are also distinctive if you look at them more specifically. So a mother sees her son watching TV, not doing homework. This line sort of expresses verbal irony. Don't let me distract you from your duties, but when you're finished with your serious studies, maybe you could take some time out for recreation and do maths. So here we're getting the sense that the mother's not happy that her child's watching TV, but is sort of joking around, pretending that TV's the real work and maths is the sort of, fun thing to do at the end, when really it's the other way around. Vernacular is another technique which you can look at. So again, we're looking at that idea of tone when we're examining vernacular. This is everyday language used by the average person in a region. So colloquial and casual like we've already looked at. This may refer to the range of vocabulary of the person who's speaking. It can also refer to common colloquialisms or local sayings. So it's really a way of expressing the voice of the characters and also to a lesser extent the narrator or the author. So lines like "G'day mate" are Australian vernacular for good morning. "Wicked air bro," that sort of thing is skateboarding vernacular, for getting high in the air. It's sort of things which normal people wouldn't use, but people who belong to a specific group might use, when they're around other people of that sort. So now let's have a look at applying these techniques. Now you need to be able to identify these techniques in your texts. So it's a really good idea to go through all your texts and to search for these techniques, to highlight them, underline them, just get familiar with real examples of these sort of abstract concepts. You should underline and highlight these when you're reading a text for the first time. So it's a really good idea to just have a pencil out the first time you're reading through a text and to underline some key techniques which jump out at you the first time you read. Obviously, once you analyze these at a greater extent, with your teacher, you're going to be getting a stronger analysis, but first impressions provide a really useful starting point. You can use these techniques in your essay writing, and a good exercise is to try and produce an example for each technique on your own. So try to go through this list and produce an example of your own.